I would like to explain why I consider a headscarf ban for schoolgirls, or to put it positively, the headscarf-free school, to be not only one of many necessary measures, but also the decisive integration and women's policy measure of our time, which would also have a meaningful internal security and immigration policy effect and send a political signal to the outside world in the fight against Islamism. It is also important to refute concerns about such a headscarf ban, which still seem to be widespread even in the Islam-critical camp. For example, when Gunter Wallraff argued in an interview with Spiegel Online, December 2007, that a state ban would always affect the wrong people. Not all headscarves are the same, Wallraff suggests, in line with the Islam apologists of the multiculti faction, that the meaning and function of the Islamic headscarf is indeterminably lost in the heterogeneity or confusion caused by the alleged versatility of the motives of its wearers. The fact that the headscarf is worn voluntarily by some Muslim women is then supposed to be an argument against the headscarf ban. In truth, the opposite is true. To understand this, however, requires a critical understanding of both the objective meaning of the headscarf and the Islamic orthopraxy that creates this meaning. The relationship between Islam and sexuality is of central importance here. In contrast to traditional Christianity and its societies, which condemned sexuality as animalistic and sought the domination of the mind over the body, the ego over the ID, the dominated over the uncontrolled, sexuality as such does not represent a danger to be banished for Islam. It is not the drives themselves, but their respective use that can benefit or harm the social order of Islam. This order does not presuppose that the individual, i.e., as will be shown, the man, suppresses or controls his instincts in principle, but rather that he should use them in accordance with the requirements of the religious system. Contrary to popular opinion, the relationship between Islam and sexuality is therefore not one of repression. On the contrary, there are four functions that make maritally sanctioned coitus between a man and a woman in Islam a sacred biopolitical act that is both a state or ummah service and a worship service in one. The first thing to mention is the reproductive function, which Islam declares to be the central telos of sexual union. This is not only about the reproduction and continued existence of the Islamic community, but also about its expansion, i.e. increasing the power of family ties and the clan within the Ummah, as well as the Ummah as a whole vis-a-vis the societies of non-Islamic believers. The Quran already addresses sexual intercourse in images of biology and agriculture. Surah 2, verse 223, for example, states, "Your wives are a field of seed to you. Therefore, till your field as you wish." And in the comparatively liberal and at the same time important theologian and moral teacher of Islam, Al-Ghazali, died in 1111. The woman also appears as a field that the man has to cultivate like a sexual farmer. Otherwise, both will sin against the obvious purposes of creation and the divine purpose of our genitals, as it is said. Accordingly, anyone who does not marry neglects the tillage, spoils the seed, and leaves the apparatus created by God and used. Secondly, according to Islamic theology, the sexual instinct should not only force the production of children, but is also a wise institution in another respect. For the pleasure associated with its satisfaction is supposed to point to the delights promised in paradise. The Islamic theologian Al-Sudi, died in 1505, writes about these delights. Every time one sleeps with a Huri, one discovers a virgin. The rod of the chosen one never goes limp again. The erection is eternal. For Al-Ghazali, the significance of the earthly pleasures that the woman has to provide for her husband lies in awakening the desire for the permanent enjoyment of the same in paradise, and thus inciting them to serve God, i.e. to obey the laws of Allah on earth, i.e. to the efforts of the great jihad against unbelief in oneself and the small jihad against the unbelievers. On the other hand, since an erection in this world, at least if it is permanent, impairs the fulfillment of religious duties, it is suspected of being devilish. According to Islamic tradition, a third of the faith disappears when the member becomes erect. Prophet's uncle Ibn Abbas is said to have tirelessly spread the warning that the penetrating man penetrates the unknown and loses respect for reason and religion. For this organ is the most powerful tool of Satan's dominion over man. Therefore, thirdly, the discharge of urges as quickly as possible after an erection during sexual intercourse is a kind of exorcism. After all, every potentially dangerous erection also contains the opportunity to intensify faith, as long as the discharge of the devilish passion via the woman, and thus a transformation of Satan's power into procreation, raditz, is guaranteed. This results in a peculiar variant of dirty talk. The beginning of the sexual act is to be accompanied by a Bismillah in the name of Allah. Its end by Allahu Akbar, Allah is great. During the act, the Sunnah recommends the following exclamation: "Keep Satan away from us, and keep him away from what you give us of children." Sahih Muslim 259. Hans Peter Raditz writes, according to the Ghazali, which is still valid today, with every ejaculation and the formulas of hope that accompany it, the man strikes a successful blow against Satan in himself and, above all, in the woman, as well as against non-Islamic unbelief, by producing Islamic offspring. End quote. Fourthly, by reducing the tension caused by the sexual drive, which the woman has to take care of by disposing of erections, she increases the man's willingness to perform not only in religious but also in profane economic terms. Often weary of dutiful work, female intercourse offers the God-fearing man the rest he needs, according to Al-Ghazali, by chasing away resentment, resting the mind, and invigorating the soul. The divine purpose of the genitals thus revolves around the potency of the man in all four functions of sexuality, because it is this potency that sets the pace for the primordial Islamic biorhythm of coitus, conception, pregnancy, and birth, as well as the constant search for ways to discharge urges. Where the ideal of Christian marriage as a love relationship minimizes sexuality, the Islamic marriage forms of arranged marriage, kinship marriage, plural marriage, and temporary marriage for pleasure, as well as the right and duty to chastise or informally expel the wife as soon as she refuses sex or proves to be infertile, guarantee the maximization of sexuality in accordance with patrilineal reproductive optimization. Love expressly plays no role in this. On the contrary, it is dismissed as animalistic. Any offense to the Islamic man's narcissistic fantasy of omnipotence, for example through a situation that exposes him to criticism, comparison, and competition, must be avoided because it could have a negative effect on his sexual potency and or the woman's desire to conceive. Therefore, the younger and less experienced the woman, the greater her willingness to submit and the less effort is required to protect her virginity. This logic explains the popularity of marrying off underage daughters. The phallic cult of the biopolitical system is reflected not least in the fact that the only recognized reason for a woman to leave her husband is his impotence or inability to procreate. If conjugal coitus is therefore the highest priority of faith, extramarital coitus, zina, including adultery, is tantamount to apostasy, especially on the part of the woman, and is punished harshly in this world and in the hereafter according to Sharia law. If the woman refuses her husband, this can be interpreted as a partial apostasy, so that she must accept and affirm her punishment/chastisement as worship. While she is therefore ideally permanently sexually available to her own husband, she must be invisible to all other men and guard her chastity. This is not a matter of her own honor, but as Sayyid Qutb, influential Islamist, hanged in 1966, says of the family, of society, of humanity. The central position in the Islamic reproductive process as mother, marital sexual object, housekeeper, and sometimes co-fighter makes the woman both a saint and the greatest domestic security risk, which is why she must be treated with constant mistrust. "I will not leave men a more ominous source of trouble than women," says the Prophet. It is not because Islam fights sexuality, but because it releases the male drive and controls the female drive that any semblance of female self-determination, any attempt to freely dispose of one's own body, is an attack on the biosystem of the Ummah. To protect this biotheological order, a whole apparatus of surveillance and punishment, a virginity or chastity cage, is erected around girls and women. The punishment practices range from violation, confinement and coital deprivation to beatings, corporal punishment and rape, including gang rape, to the notorious open honor killing, the veiled variant of which is referred to as balcony girls, i.e. those driven to jump out of the window. Apart from drastic genital mutilation, which is not practiced in all Islamic countries, the central surveillance techniques are the domestic isolation and public veiling associated with forced marriages. Ibn Taymiyyah, died 1328, an Orthodox fighter for Islam and source of ideas for modern Islamism, summarizes their interplay in line with the Quran and Sunnah. The covering of clothes and houses must be imposed on them, women, because their public appearance means fitna, rebellion, and men are above them. End quote. The more time a woman spends at home, the more insistently she can devote herself to her worship, which, even before prayer, is defined by the disposal of erections, the bearing and rearing of children and housekeeping, and spares the public the sight of her, i.e. the danger of fitna. Outside the home, she is only tolerated as a disembodied and de-individualized, i.e. uniform ghostly appearance that ideally attracts neither visual nor acoustic attention, and therefore refrains from wearing jewelry and makeup as well as clattering heels and speaking. Otherwise, she is almost naturally at risk of being raped. In a speech given by Taj al-Din al-Hilali, Grand Mufti of Australia, on the occasion of Ramadan in the fall of 2006 on the subject of a woman's duty to cover herself, it sounds like this: uncovered flesh attracts cats. If it is left uncovered outside on the street or in the garden or in the park, the cats will come and eat it. Is that the fault of the cats or the uncovered meat? End quote. This is the standard narrative that Muslim girls grow up with, as can be read in all autobiographies critical of Islam. In most Islamic countries, men can then help fulfill this prophecy with impunity. And it is not only in French banlieues that gang rape is a popular variant of virtue terror against unveiled and other unruly women. In the hegemonic and dominant form of orthopraxy, Islam is therefore a religion that is existentially based on coitus and violence. To this day, the central socio-political customs of archaic Arab tribal life, which Muhammad once integrated into monotheism, are cultivated by Islam. Apart from, but not entirely independent of, questions of humanism, the Islamic biosystem is proving to be extremely dysfunctional in the face of the demands of the capitalist Republican world, at least beyond the social elites. This, and not the brief episode of colonialism or the racism of the majority society, is the main cause of the misery in the Islamic world and the Islamic communities of the West that Muslims feel so humiliated by. Accordingly, the re-Islamization sought by Islamists and the Orthodox produces an endless loop of constantly increasing impoverishment, both there and here, because it tries to cast out the devil with the Beelzebub. The increasing terror of virtue and suicide are an expression of this madness and mark different stages of jihad against oneself and others. So-called honor killings are on the rise in Germany, steadily since 9/11, 2001. And abruptly and exponentially since Merkel opened the border, 2015. This is not just a question of quantity. Since Islam has become part of Germany according to official doctrine, and the Islamic counter-society has increased its power through mass immigration, it also seems to be part of Germany that women are bestially slaughtered in public, on the street, in supermarkets and subway stations, in the truest sense of the word, mostly with knives and, more recently, axes. These are neither isolated cases, nor are the blood-curdling killings individual pathological deviations from the norm in the conventional sense. On the contrary, these acts are almost logical culmination points of an escalating crisis dynamic that is necessarily set in motion from the middle of the Islamic concept of honor and Islamic sexual morality, as soon as the archaic patriarchal tradition is to be maintained in the midst of modern social life. In order to be able to make sense of the ruthlessness with which throats are cut and heads severed in front of everyone's eyes, which leaves us stunned and perplexed, it is important to realize that murders celebrated in this way have ritual and political dimensions. It is true that the fact that entire streets of Oriental cities are drenched in the blood of lambs as part of Muslim sacrificial festivals, and that not only religious dignitaries, but everyone from toddlers to the elderly takes part in public wallowing in blood and slaughter with knives speaks for a fundamental overcoming of the abhorrence of blood and creaturely suffering in an Islamically socialized person. More importantly, what is known in the West as honor killing is not murder at all in Arabic, but washing of honor, ghasl al-sharaf. In Egypt it is called washing away shame, ghasl al-ar. This is an explicit allusion to the religious rite of purification. While the small ablution, wudu, of the face, hands, and feet performed before prayer removes the unavoidable impurities of everyday life, Food, excretion, touching other people. The great ablution, guzzle, cleanses the whole body, including the genitals, in response to an outstanding contaminating event, coitus within marriage, menstruation, birth. According to this model, the blood spilled in an honor killing cleanses the victim of pollution, washing away his or her shame as well as that of the family. Even in the sacrifice of the beloved daughter, sister, or wife, the perpetrator, whom the Turks call the victim of fate, sacrifices himself in defense of the family honor, without which no social life in the Ummah is possible. And yet the perpetrator is not so driven that he even murders in public on the basis of spontaneously uncontrollable emotions, virtually forgetting himself in the process. On the contrary, he explicitly seeks publicity because this is the political moment. As an executor of Islamic law, he is setting an example, showing all women in the Islamic community what they will face if they behave unruly or if rumors of such behavior arise. It should also be borne in mind that Western sexual morality, which is rejected by at least 68% of Muslims in Germany, Bretfeld/Wetzel study from 2007, and Islamic sexual morality categorically cannot coexist peacefully because they follow antagonistic premises and challenge or provoke each other in their respective claims to general and global validity. Either the right to sexual self-determination and free development of the personality applies to all citizens of a society, or Islamic chastity norms apply. Because the two cannot coexist, there is no parallel Islamic society, only a counter-society, whose attacks on the foundations of the majority society will inevitably increase the more the counter-society grows or the more powerful it feels. Accordingly, the increase in sexual assaults and acts of violence by Muslims against indigenous women since 2015, ranging from abuse as a whore or slut in the street, including spitting on them, to the events on Cologne's Domplat and killings, are nothing new. The justification for the honor killing of Hatun Suruku on February 7, 2005, she lived like a German, which was advocated by many Muslim students at the time, already included the whispered propensity for violence against non-Muslim women. Even then, a lack of awareness of the injustice of raping women who do not conform to Islam could be observed in large parts of the Islamic community. Women had too many freedoms, and a woman is just not supposed to have such freedoms. The head of a Berlin youth facility explains the image of male migrant youth and continues, at least not their own wife. All other women, let's say, are just prostitutes for them. Zentrum Kultur Unii Demokratie, 2003, page 129. As early as 1995, one could read, the father of a young Turk who, together with some compatriots, had raped a young Kreuzberg woman who had gone out on the street at night, commented on the crime with the words, "If I had been there, I would have fucked along." End quote. It is also not new that such thinking can be found confirmed not only in the Quran and Sunnah, but also in the statements of contemporary Islamic dignitaries. Uncovered flesh attracts cats. If it is left uncovered outside on the street or in the garden or park, the cats will come and eat it. Is that the fault of the cats or the uncovered meat? Asked Taj al-Din al-Hilali, Grand Mufti in Australia at the time, rhetorically in a speech on the occasion of Ramadan in the fall of 2006. This is the standard narrative that Muslim children grow up with in different variations, as can be read in countless autobiographies of women and men affected by Islam. That's how it was, and that's how it still is. None of this is new, and all of it has been known for decades. What is new is the blatant increase in cases in the present day, the expansion of no-go areas for women without male company, and the brazenness with which the perpetrators go about their work and display their brutal brutality, who must feel encouraged and emboldened in the face of years of inactivity by a majority society that not only appears paralyzed, but actively and permanently narcotizes itself. For example, when, as in Limburg, a German of Tunisian background first runs over his wife with his car and then maltreats or kills her to death with an axe and butcher's knife, insulting her as a slut, and the media report this as an ordinary relationship crime by German citizens in RTL, for example, takes the opportunity to inform viewers about statistics on violent acts in German relationships. And with such disarticulation of Islamic crime contexts, if reported at all, works towards the right-wing populace, even though the opposite is supposedly intended. However, should the barrel overflow at some point, Should the majority of society recognize the war declared on it as such and want to respond by effectively protecting the prospective victims of Islamic violence? The Merkel left should therefore refrain from drawing a lesson from Auschwitz as a compliment to Galen's Vogelschiss in terms of remembrance policy that anti-Semites, misogynists, and homophobes should be welcomed and left to their own devices, as long as they are not by German. It would already be clear that classic law and order policies will not be able to deal with the conditions that lead to honor killings. Neither controlled borders, nor more police and Secret Service work, nor harsh punishment of the perpetrators, which stops considering migration background as a mitigating factor, will prevent honor killings, because the victim of fate would rather serve their sentence in prison than sin against Allah and die a social death in the Ummah. Because police presence does not deter him, and because neither the individual perpetrator nor the family council at the kitchen table of the private home where the honor killing is decided can be infiltrated by the Secret Service. That is why the Muslims who are there now must be integrated, or even if Erdogan considers this a crime against humanity, assimilated, and that would only be possible from the outset with measures that really grab the repressive collective, the connection between honor and shame, the Islamic sexual morality, by the balls. The most important and unavoidable step in the long overdue turnaround in integration policy would be a ban on headscarves, especially for schoolgirls, but also at universities and in all state authorities, flanked by measures to enforce compulsory education, including breaking the practice of deregistering Muslim girls from coeducational sex education, sports, and swimming lessons. In Austria, at least, this turnaround has now been initiated. In May of this year, a ban on headscarves for primary school children was passed by Parliament, making an anti-racist and feminist demand for the emancipation of migrant girls and women, which Terre de Femmes has been petitioning for in Germany since 2018, a political reality. However, it was not the political left, which once claimed to be fighting against patriarchy and for the liberation of women, for the sexual self-determination of the individual and against discrimination against people on the basis of their migration background, that pushed through this law against the resistance of reactionary, old white men. It was a right-wing governing coalition of VP and FP. The left-wing opposition, with the exception of 2 MPs, voted unanimously against it. This upside-down world, measured by the traditional political compass, also exists in Germany. However, Terre de Femmes will not only fail for the time being due to the resistance of a still hegemonic postmodern left, which subordinates the old feminism to the new anti-racism and exposes women to the barbarism of noble savages, but also due to liberalist doubts in the CDU and FDP. Does it not contradict religious freedom to prohibit the wearing of a religious symbol by those who, unlike teachers, are not subject to the state's duty of neutrality in religious matters? And wouldn't a general ban be an unacceptable encroachment on the civil liberties of those who wear the headscarf voluntarily? Wouldn't a blanket ban also affect the wrong people? It is therefore apparently of no use that Terre de Femmes, as a precautionary measure, commissioned the constitutional law expert Martin Nettesheim to produce an expert opinion stating that such a ban would not be a violation of the basic law, i.e. would not conflict with religious freedom or parents' right to education. When the family policy spokesman for the CDU/CSU parliamentary group, Marcus Weinberg, CDU, justifies his rejection of the headscarf ban as follows: the blanket ban on headscarves, as in Austria, also disadvantages girls who have voluntarily chosen to wear a headscarf as a sign of their religion. End quote. If the postmodern left are lost to the cause of feminist and migrant-friendly emancipation due to their unresponsiveness in principle, it may still make sense to demonstrate that the liberal fear that a headscarf ban could also affect the wrong people is unfounded or a misunderstanding of oneself by proving that the headscarf is anything but a sign of religion, and that the undeniable voluntary nature of some wearers is precisely, and even more so, the legitimization of its ban. Instead of getting lost in the confusion of the allegedly diverse motives of headscarf wearers, it would be important to develop a critical understanding of both the objective meaning of the headscarf and the Islamic orthopraxy that creates this meaning. Then the issue of individual motives is no longer particularly complicated. In human history, patriarchy emerged at the moment of transition from nomadism to sedentarism and from tribal property to individual private property, with the aim of preserving the continuity of male rule over women. In order to ensure the patrilineal line of inheritance, women were obligated to monogamy, i.e., extramarital chastity, and rape was criminalized for the first time, not because of a still unknown right to sexual self-determination for women, but as an illegitimate encroachment on the patriarch's property. The first forms of social regulation of sexual drive, and thus also a comparative de-threatening of the natural gender relationship. The Islamic patriarchy, which still prevails, differs from the Occidental patriarchy, which has since been overcome, in its phallocentric imperative, whose material implementation in ideology and institution is impressive in terms of its internal consistency, ruthless consistency, and rigorosity. While the Occidental patriarchal regulation of drives, from the siren episode of Odysseus to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount to the modern processes described by Norbert Elias, has always demanded that men also renounce their drives. Islamic phallocentrism places the responsibility for male renunciation of drives solely on women. Within marriage, the woman must be permanently sexually available to her husband, even if she were on the back of a camel, sunnah. This is because the rejection of the urge within marriage as soon as it arises firstly frees the man for the ritual commandments of the religion, secondly protects him from the desire for other women, and thus from the capital offense of extramarital fornication or adultery, and thirdly aims at male offspring in order to increase the power of the ummah, birth jihad. Outside of marriage, it is her task not to arouse the instincts of other men in the first place. She does this by erasing herself in public as a sexual being, as a woman, and dehumanizing herself into a ghost. By concealing physical features, lowering her gaze, avoiding noises such as the clattering of heels or speaking. She has to be invisible and inaudible, whereby the concept of publicity for her is defined by the presence of men who are not immediate relatives, grandpa, father, brother. The extramarital desexualization commandments corresponding to intramarital oversexualization therefore also apply at home as soon as male visitors are received, and not in public as soon as women are among themselves, as in baths. The headscarf therefore has nothing to do with an individual relationship between believers and God. It does not fulfill a ritual function, but only a sexual political function in gender relations. Since female misconduct threatens the cohesion of the entire ummah with the social regulation of sexual drive, the honor of the family depends on no rumors spreading about non-compliant actions of the responsible women, whereby fathers, brothers, and husbands become guardians of virtue for their daughters, sisters, and wives, who erect a virginity and then chastity cage of surveillance and punishment around them until marriage. If there is therefore no unsupervised premarital and extramarital contact with the opposite sex, love marriages are just as impossible as lifelong non-sexual friendships between men and women. In principle, however, one's own subjugation can always be libidinized, for example by abstractly translating real powerlessness into the fantasy of being able to drive all men crazy and bring down the entire ummah by taking off the headscarf. If I remember correctly, Ayaan Hirsi Ali once ironically reported on her disappointment in this respect when taking off the headscarf did not cause anything in the Dutch public. Conformist Islamic behavior is also rewarded in concrete terms. Chaste virtue and bearing sons allow women to rise in the female internal hierarchy. They are allowed to give orders to the weaker women of the extended family household and have them serve them. In this respect, patriarchy lures women into collaboration. Women desire the headscarf and their sons as surrogate penises, their phallic power. They become accomplices, in that mothers in particular raise their sons to be pashas and help turn their daughters into second-class human beings. In Western bourgeois sexual morality, there is not only legal equality of the sexes. Even female promiscuity and body-hugging clothing are legitimate ways of developing one's personality without indicating sexual availability. If a collective tries to live according to Islamic codes of morality, even when it is surrounded as a minority by a majority society with diametrically opposed sexual morals, then the repressive pressure on its own members and the aggression against an environment and its representatives that tempt them to misstep are increased almost automatically. If the majority society then also signals to the Islamic collective that it is under anti-racist minority protection and that its culture is worth preserving, then it exposes those individuals in the majority and minority who want to make use of Western guaranteed freedoms as a matter of course to the increasingly unrestrained repression of a counter-justice system. In language schools and integration courses, of all places, informal alliances between young Islamic men and teaching staff against women fighting for their freedom are systematically formed time and again. In headscarf debates, which in any case have only been conducted on the headscarf ban for female teachers in this country, the garment is always understood as a religious symbol by both opponents and supporters, whereby the reduction to the symbolic alone misunderstands the headscarf as an object that is merely a carrier of meaning for something different from itself, regardless of its material composition. But this is only half the truth. To stay with half the truth for the time being, a few words on the objective symbolic meaning. In comparatively abstract terms, the headscarf does not indicate affiliation to a particular religion understood as a private quirk, but functions politically as the flag of the jihadists, an identifying mark with whose constant spread Salafists and the pinstripe Islamists of Orthodox associational Islam mark their seizure of public space. In this sense, it is a symbolic hinge for the core elements of Islamism and orthopraxy, and thus also stands not least for self-sacrifice and suicidal terror, anti-Semitism, Sharia law, hatred of women and gays, and the corresponding terror of virtue. In comparatively concrete terms, the headscarf is a symbol of a threefold segregation. Gender apartheid separates men and women within Islam along the boundaries of Islamically understood public and private spheres. The theological political apartheid also separates the good Muslim women, headscarf wearers, from the bad Muslim women or sluts, non-wearers, within Islam. A dichotomy that is maintained even in places where headscarves are compulsory by the state, for example in Iran, as Fathia Nagibzadeh has pointed out, where a distinction is made between ba hijab and bad hijab. Ba hijab means the chaste wearing of the headscarf, and thus stately Muslim women. Bad hijab means indecent wearing that does not cover the hair on the forehead, and thus bad, westernized Muslim women. In the sense of cultural apartheid, the headscarf demonstrates, not only in the diaspora, the ostentatious separation of the Ummah from and its contempt for the secular, individualistic, hedonistic culture of Western societies. However, to get to the whole truth, the headscarf is not just a mere symbol or marker of patriarchal Islamic rule and oppression. It is this itself, or rather one of its preferred media/means/ techniques, which, as Chador Javin puts it, leaves indelible traces in the psyche, sexuality, and social identity of those on whom it is imposed from puberty onwards at the latest, and in this sense constitutes mental and physical abuse. Nothing is therefore more inappropriate than declaring the headscarf a religious symbol and either wanting to allow it with a cross and kippah in public spaces or wanting to ban it with a cross and kippah. If one understands the headscarf in contrast to the kippah and the cross, in its double form as firstly, an essential tool of oppression of the patriarchal chastity cage that materially inscribes itself into the affected body under the threat and exercise of violence, and secondly, both a concrete symbol for the entire misogynistic apparatus of surveillance and punishment, which includes forced and short marriages, genital mutilation, stoning of adulteresses and honor killings, as well as an abstract political symbol of modern hostility and Islamism, then it is not only unacceptable for female teachers and civil servants, but especially and even more so for female pupils. Pupils, girls and boys alike, cannot be successfully educated to become self-confident citizens with equal rights in a classroom in which the means of domination and symbol of lived patriarchy and misogyny is simultaneously permitted, especially as the social pressure on non-wearers and their parents increases with the growing number of headscarves worn. Javin says, the majority of Muslim women do not want to wear headscarves, and they do not want to be confused with this symbol of alienation. Unfortunately, journalists don't report on this. I have met schoolgirls in France who are begging their teachers, please don't let them wear the headscarf at school. If you allow it, our parents will force it on us too. End quote. The bourgeois state's duty of neutrality towards religion is not called for here, because this would be identical to taking sides with the anti-bourgeois clan. Solidarity with young migrant women and liberal parents in the name of their civil rights would be the order of the day here. Even and especially if they and girls who do not want to wear headscarves were a minority within the Islamic community, because it is precisely these parents and girls that civil society should be concerned with. The headscarf ban for schoolgirls would therefore be the long overdue state social and educational support for these girls, and their emancipatory struggle for rights that are taken for granted by non-migrant women. By initially providing girls with limited headscarf-free public spaces and times, it makes the headscarf potentially superfluous, as the fabric can only unfold its sexual, political, and ideological effect in the total claim to public time and space. By eroding this claim, the ban made an important and unavoidable contribution to removing the foundations of the Islamic concept of honor and the dynamics of violence associated with it as the main obstacle to liberation. The state compulsion, ostensibly limited to its space and time, for general unveiling would remove girls and liberal parents from individual responsibility and thus from the line of fire of the Klan. In summary, the headscarf-free school would not just be one of many necessary measures, but the decisive integration and women's policy measure of our time, which would also have a meaningful effect on security and immigration policy internally and send a political signal in the fight against Islamism externally. There is no reason to design the conditions in Germany in such a way that Islamists can feel at home in them and are therefore virtually attracted to them. At the same time, there are concerns about the ban, especially among those critics of Islam who focus on the image of the illiterate victim Muslim. As soon as they are confronted with self-confident and educated women wearing the headscarf who claim to wear it voluntarily, from which it can then be learned that it is all rather complicated and confusing with the headscarf, and that we don't even know how large the proportion of voluntary and forced wearers is, as if that were relevant. On the one hand, it is nothing new at all that authoritarian characters are attracted by authoritarian ideologies, and therefore many individuals prefer to voluntarily submit and give up for a fixed place in the collective rather than take on personal responsibility and live with the ambivalences and uncertainties that freedom in modern societies entails. The fellow campaigners and perpetrators of the Islamic patriarchy would rightly see the headscarf ban for schoolgirls as repression against their free decision to submit and propaganda, sometimes by spitting on non-wearers for Islam, but stopping them, at least at school, is precisely its purpose. The second type of voluntary headscarf wearer is the favorite child of the postmodern left and its projections. The assumed fashionable Muslim woman has a folkloristic relationship to the piece of fabric. This is then brought into play either as a chic accessory or as an identity-affirming protest against the racism of the majority society. However, such a headscarf could easily be taken off at school, provided it has nothing to do with Islamic sexual morality, i.e. the presence of foreign men, as claimed. In addition, these headscarf wearers could certainly be expected to criticize their voluntarism. For as long as women around the world are systematically forced to wear the Islamic headscarf and terrorized, for example with hydrochloric acid attacks, in the event of insubordination, it is simply not suitable for fashionable gimmicks or even as a sign of protest against racism. The headscarf ban for schoolgirls therefore affects the right people without exception, regardless of who votes for it and for what reasons. It certainly cannot be denied that some racists or xenophobes in petitions or right-wing populists in the Bundestag would vote in favor of a headscarf ban, for example, because the headscarf offends them as foreign or un-German clothing. However, this should not scare people off from making common cause, but on the contrary should make them happy. After all, the social effects of a ban on headscarves would in any case be beneficial to women and migrants. And there aren't that many occasions when racists and xenophobes could be good for something.